As long as my son is married to you, every dollar you earn belongs to this family," my mother-in-law said, lifting her wine glass as if she had just shared a charming family joke instead of an insult. Everyone at the table went quiet. The soft music from the restaurant speakers suddenly seemed louder. The clink of silverware from nearby tables felt distant. I looked across the table at Evelyn Bennett, a woman who had spent nearly 20 years convincing everyone around her that control was the same thing as love. At 68, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her silver hair was perfectly styled. Her pearl necklace rested neatly against her navy blouse. To anyone watching, she looked like a proud mother enjoying dinner with her family. Only those of us sitting at that table knew how carefully she measured every word and every gesture. My husband Daniel lowered his eyes to his plate. That hurt more than her comment. After 15 years of marriage, I knew exactly what that silence meant. He wasn't agreeing with her. He wasn't disagreeing either. He was doing what he had done his entire life, staying out of the way. I smiled politely and took a sip of water. "That's an interesting perspective," I said. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, clearly pleased that she had made her point. "Family resources should stay under family guidance," she replied. "People make mistakes with money when emotions get involved." She was looking directly at me when she said it. I had heard versions of this speech before. When Daniel and I bought our first home, Evelyn wanted access to every financial document. When I received a promotion at work, she suggested my salary should be deposited into a family-managed account. When I inherited a small amount from my late aunt, she offered to help me invest it. Her help always came with strings attached. Her advice always seemed to benefit her more than anyone else. The dinner continued, but the mood never recovered. By the time dessert arrived, everyone was talking about safe topics like weather, vacations, and local events. Yet I could still feel Evelyn watching me from across the table, waiting for a reaction she would never get. The night air was cool when Daniel and I returned home. Our two-story house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees. The porch light cast a warm glow across the driveway. For a moment, I stood outside and enjoyed the silence. "She didn't mean anything by it," Daniel said as he unlocked the front door. I almost laughed. "You know that's not true." He sighed but didn't answer. That told me everything I needed to know. Later that evening, after Daniel had gone upstairs, I sat alone in my home office reviewing documents for work. Numbers had always calmed me. They followed rules. They made sense. People were harder. As I organized a stack of papers, I noticed an envelope mixed in with several files Daniel had brought home from his mother's house after helping her clean out a storage cabinet earlier that week. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges. My name wasn't on it. Neither was Daniel's. In the corner was a law firm's logo I recognized immediately. I turned it over in my hands. Something felt strange. Important. The room seemed unusually quiet as I carefully opened the flap and unfolded the first page. At first, it looked like just another legal document. Then I noticed a date from nearly 20 years ago and a name that stopped me cold. I read the line again, then a third time. My heartbeat quickened. Suddenly, Evelyn's behavior, her obsession with control, her constant interference in our finances, all of it felt connected to something much bigger. I stared at the document for a long time. My coffee had gone cold beside me. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees. Inside, I realized that the woman who spent years trying to control my money might have been hiding a secret far more valuable than money itself. I did not sleep much that night. The document remained on my desk long after midnight, while questions circled through my mind. I had learned years ago that acting too quickly usually created more problems than solutions. So instead of jumping to conclusions, I did what I always did when something felt wrong. I started looking for facts. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Daniel had already left for work. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. I unfolded the document again and read every line carefully. The law firm's letterhead was genuine. The signatures appeared authentic. The date was real. What bothered me was the name attached to the transfer. It was connected to the Bennett family, yet it had never once come up during the 15 years I had been married to Daniel. Families have secrets. I understood that. Every family hides old mistakes, painful memories, or disagreements they would rather forget. But this felt different. This felt intentional. Over the years, Evelyn had always positioned herself as the guardian of family history. She controlled the stories people heard. She corrected details during holiday dinners. She reminded everyone who had sacrificed what and who owed gratitude to whom. Looking back, I realized she never simply shared information. She managed it. That afternoon, I found myself remembering dozens of small moments I had ignored before. The time Evelyn insisted on reviewing paperwork when Daniel and I refinanced our home. The time she became unusually upset after a conversation about inheritance laws. The time she abruptly changed the subject when an older relative mentioned events from 20 years earlier. At the time, each incident seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. I opened my laptop and began organizing notes. Dates, names, locations. Nothing dramatic, just details, pieces of a puzzle. The more I looked, the more I noticed gaps where explanations should have been. By evening, I had filled several pages. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. Why would Evelyn spend decades protecting information that should have been public knowledge within her own family? 2 days later, an opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Daniel called during lunch and mentioned he would be helping his mother sort through old records stored in her garage over the weekend. He said it casually, as if discussing grocery shopping. My pulse quickened. She still has boxes from your father's office? I asked. Probably, he said. Mom keeps everything. That answer stayed with me long after the call ended. Evelyn did keep everything. Birthday cards, tax returns, photographs, receipts. She preserved the past with almost obsessive care. If the document on my desk pointed toward a larger secret, there was a good chance additional pieces still existed somewhere among those boxes. That evening, I sat alone on the back patio as the sun disappeared behind the neighboring houses. A warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the yard. I thought about confronting Evelyn directly. It would have been easier, simpler, but something told me she was prepared for questions. What she would never expect was patience. For years, Evelyn had assumed she understood everyone around her. She believed she could predict every reaction and control every outcome. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I made a quiet decision. I would not accuse her. I would not reveal what I had found. Not yet. Instead, I would keep smiling. I would keep listening. And I would keep looking for the truth hidden beneath the story she had spent years teaching everyone else to believe. Saturday arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for early spring. By 10 o'clock that morning, Daniel and I were driving across town toward Evelyn's house. She had lived there for more than 30 years, in the same large brick home where she had raised her family and accumulated enough memories to fill every closet, drawer, and storage shelf. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the garage door was already open. Cardboard boxes were stacked along the walls. Metal filing cabinets stood partially emptied near the back. Evelyn was directing everything like a project manager overseeing an important operation. She greeted me with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Thank you for helping," she said. "There is more paperwork than I realized." I returned her smile. Happy to help. For the next several hours, we sorted through old records, tax documents, insurance policies, utility bills, decades of ordinary paperwork. Dust floated through the sunlight, streaming in from the open garage door. The scent of old cardboard and faded paper filled the air. Daniel worked near the front while Evelyn moved between stacks, deciding what should be kept and what should be discarded. I stayed quiet and focused. That seemed to make her comfortable. Around noon, she left to prepare lunch inside the house. Daniel followed a few minutes later after receiving a phone call from work. For the first time all morning, I was alone. I looked around the garage. Everything appeared ordinary. Then I noticed a narrow metal file box tucked beneath a folding table. Unlike the other containers, it was locked. The label had faded, but one word remained visible. Archive. Something about it caught my attention immediately. Most people do not lock away utility bills or holiday receipts. I crouched beside it and examined the surface. The box was old, scratched, and clearly used often. A small key was attached to a hook underneath the table. That surprised me. If the contents were unimportant, why lock it? If they were important, why leave the key nearby? I hesitated. Then I unlocked it. Inside were neatly organized folders. Nothing appeared dramatic at first glance. Legal correspondence, property records, business documents. Yet as I flipped through the files, I noticed several names repeated again and again. Some belonged to family members. Others did not. One folder immediately stood out because I recognized the law firm from the document sitting on my desk at home. My pulse quickened. Carefully, I opened it. Several pages were missing. The remaining papers contained references to meetings, asset transfers, and agreements dating back nearly 2 decades. Certain sections had been highlighted. Notes appeared in the margins written in what looked like Evelyn's handwriting. I read each page slowly. The details were still incomplete, but a clearer picture was beginning to emerge. Whatever had happened years ago involved money, property, and a decision that affected more people than anyone realized. Footsteps echoed from inside the house. I quickly returned everything exactly where I had found it and locked the box. Moments later, Evelyn appeared, carrying a tray of sandwiches and iced tea. Her expression remained pleasant, but I noticed something new. She glanced toward the file box before looking at me. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. During lunch, she spoke more than usual. She asked questions about work, about future plans, about finances. The conversation felt casual on the surface, yet every topic seemed to circle back to money and control. I answered carefully. The less she suspected, the better. By the end of the afternoon, I had learned 2 important things. First, the document I found at home was not an isolated piece of history. Second, Evelyn was protecting something far larger than a simple family secret. The following Monday, I could not stop thinking about the folder I had seen in Evelyn's garage. I had only glanced at a fraction of its contents, yet it had already changed the way I viewed the Bennett family. What bothered me most was not what I knew. It was what I did not know. Missing pages, missing explanations, missing years. The gaps seemed deliberate. During my lunch break, I drove to a small coffee shop near downtown and called the number printed on the old legal documents. I expected to reach a receptionist or perhaps discover that the firm no longer existed. Instead, a calm voice answered and informed me that the practice had merged with another firm years earlier. Most records had been archived. I thanked her and almost ended the call. Then I mentioned a name from the documents. There was a brief pause. The woman transferred me to someone else. A few moments later, a man introduced himself as James Whitmore. The name sounded familiar. After a short conversation, I remembered why. Daniel's father had mentioned him years ago at a family gathering. James had handled several legal matters for the family before retiring from active practice. His voice was measured and professional. When I referenced the date on the document, he became noticeably careful with his words. He did not reveal anything confidential. He did not answer my questions directly, yet he agreed to meet for coffee later that week. That alone told me more than any explanation could have. On Thursday afternoon, we met at a quiet cafe overlooking a small city park. Children played near a fountain while office workers hurried along the sidewalks. Everything felt ordinary except for the conversation waiting to happen. James arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair and the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades listening before speaking. After a few minutes of polite conversation, I showed him a copy of the document. He studied it carefully. His expression did not change, but I noticed him exhale slowly before setting the paper down. "This is only one piece of a larger story," he said. "That is what I suspected." He nodded. Some decisions made many years ago affected several members of the family. Not everyone agreed with those decisions. I waited. Was Evelyn involved? I asked. He stirred his coffee without looking up. Evelyn was involved in nearly everything. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Over the next hour, he never violated any legal obligations. He never disclosed protected information. Yet through careful wording and subtle hints, he confirmed something important. The history I had been told after marrying Daniel was incomplete. Certain events had been presented selectively. Certain records had disappeared from ordinary family discussions, and certain people had benefited from that silence. When our meeting ended, James gathered his papers and stood. Before leaving, he looked directly at me. "If you continue looking into this," he said, "do not focus only on money. Money was never the real issue." Then he walked away. I remained at the table long after he left. His words echoed in my mind. Money was never the real issue. As the afternoon sun reflected across the windows of nearby buildings, I opened my notebook and reviewed everything I had learned. The transactions, the property records, the missing documents. Suddenly, They seemed less important than the question behind them. If this was not truly about money, then what had Evelyn been protecting for all these years? For the next several days, I approached the situation the same way I would approach a complicated financial audit. I stopped looking for dramatic revelations and started looking for patterns. Patterns rarely lied. Every evening after work, I sat at my desk with folders, notes, and copies of public records spread across the surface. The deeper I dug, the stranger everything became. Certain property transactions connected to the Bennett family seemed to appear and disappear over the years. Names changed, ownership shifted, dates overlapped in ways that made little sense. Individually, each document could be explained away. Together, they told a different story. One evening, I found an old county property record that caught my attention immediately. It referenced a parcel of land purchased more than 20 years earlier. The address meant nothing to me, but the names attached to the transaction did. One belonged to Daniel's late father. The other belonged to someone I had never heard mentioned by any member of the family. Curious, I searched further. The unfamiliar name appeared again. Then again. Not often, just enough to leave a trail. I printed every record I could find and arranged them across my desk. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This person had been connected to multiple important decisions involving family assets, yet had somehow been erased from every family conversation I had ever witnessed. That weekend, Daniel and I attended a small family gathering at Evelyn's house. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. Family photographs lined the walls. Crystal serving dishes reflected the warm light from the chandelier. Laughter drifted through the room. Everything appeared normal. Yet once I knew where to look, I noticed details I had missed before. Whenever older relatives began discussing events from the past, Evelyn subtly redirected the conversation. If someone mentioned a specific year, she changed the subject. If someone referenced an old business matter, she offered a different memory instead. Nobody seemed bothered by it. They were accustomed to her controlling the flow of conversation. I watched quietly. Near the end of the evening, one of Daniel's elderly cousins mentioned a summer gathering from more than 20 years ago. The moment was brief. Most people would have forgotten it instantly. But I noticed something unusual. Evelyn's smile disappeared for a fraction of a second. Her hand tightened around her coffee cup. Then the expression vanished. The conversation moved on. That tiny reaction stayed with me the entire drive home. It was not the response of someone protecting money. It was the response of someone protecting history. The following Tuesday, I returned to the county records office during my lunch break. The building was quiet, filled with rows of archived documents and computer terminals. After nearly 2 hours of searching, I discovered a file that connected several of the names I had been tracking. The information itself was not shocking. What shocked me was the date. It matched the same period referenced in the legal documents, the property transfers, and the missing records. Suddenly, the timeline aligned. Every strange transaction, every missing explanation, every uncomfortable reaction, they all pointed back to the same narrow window of time. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. My heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. For the first time since this investigation began, confusion was giving way to clarity. I still did not know the full truth, but I knew where it was hiding. And I was beginning to understand why Evelyn had spent so many years making sure nobody looked closely enough to find it. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Gray clouds hung low over the city as I sat alone in my office reviewing the final set of records I had collected over the previous 2 weeks. My desk was covered with folders, notes, printed documents, and timelines. What had started as a strange document hidden among old papers had become something much larger. I stared at the names I had been tracking and noticed one detail I had overlooked before. It was small, almost insignificant. Yet the moment I saw it, everything changed. The unfamiliar name that appeared throughout the records was connected to a trust established more than 20 years earlier. Until then, I had assumed that person was some forgotten business associate or distant relative. I was wrong. After requesting one final public filing, I finally saw the complete relationship. I read the page once, then twice, then a third time. My hands became completely still. The secret was not about hidden money. It was not about a missing property. It was not about a business dispute. It was about a person, a real person whose existence had been carefully removed from the family narrative. According to the records, Daniel's father had established a trust that included another beneficiary. Someone whose connection to the family had never been acknowledged publicly. Someone who should have been discussed openly years ago. Instead, their name had vanished from conversations, photographs, and family history. Suddenly, every strange reaction made sense. Every missing document, every interrupted conversation, every attempt to control information. Evelyn had not spent 2 decades protecting assets. She had spent 2 decades protecting a version of the truth. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Outside my office window, rain tapped softly against the glass. My coffee had gone cold hours earlier. I thought about Daniel. He genuinely believed he knew everything important about his family. Most people do. We trust the stories we are given when we are young. We rarely stop to ask who wrote those stories in the first place. That evening, I met Rachel Morgan for dinner. She had been my closest friend since college and one of the few people I trusted completely. I did not share every detail, but I explained enough for her to understand the situation. She listened quietly before setting down her fork. "So you think Evelyn rewrote family history?" she asked. "I think she decided which parts everyone was allowed to remember," I replied. Rachel nodded slowly. "That sounds more accurate." Her words stayed with me long after dinner ended. On the drive home, I realized something important. The evidence was becoming strong enough to reveal the truth, but I was still missing one critical piece. Motive. I knew what had been hidden. I knew roughly when it happened. I even understood how the story had been buried. What I did not fully understand was why. What had Evelyn been so afraid of losing? Reputation? Influence? Control? Perhaps all three. When I arrived home, Daniel was watching television in the living room. He smiled and asked about my day. For a moment, I felt guilty keeping everything from him. Then I remembered that I was not hiding the truth. I was uncovering it. Later that night, as I reviewed my notes one final time, I noticed a reference to an upcoming Bennett family anniversary celebration scheduled for the following month. Nearly every relative would attend. For years, Evelyn had used family gatherings to shape the narrative everyone believed. This time would be different, because for the first time, I was beginning to understand the story she never wanted anyone to hear. After discovering the truth hidden behind years of carefully managed family stories, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped investigating in public. I stopped asking questions. I stopped following obvious leads. At least that was what everyone believed. The truth was very different. Every day, I continued gathering information. I simply became much better at hiding it. The annual Bennett family anniversary celebration was now less than 4 weeks away. Relatives from several states were planning to attend. Cousins, aunts, uncles, longtime family friends, and former business associates would all be there. For most people, it was just another family gathering. For Evelyn, it was something more. It was her stage. Every year, she stood at the center of the room telling stories, sharing memories, and reminding everyone of the version of family history she wanted them to remember. This year, she seemed unusually relaxed. The more I smiled and acted normal, the more comfortable she became. During phone calls, she returned to offering financial advice I had never requested. During family dinners, she made subtle comments about responsibility and trust. She believed she was still controlling the conversation. She believed I was still listening. I let her think that. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and I visited her house for lunch. The weather was beautiful. Sunlight filled the dining room. Birds moved through the backyard garden beyond the windows. Everything looked peaceful. Halfway through the meal, Evelyn began discussing plans for the anniversary celebration. She spoke about decorations, guest lists, seating arrangements, and speeches. Then she smiled and looked directly at me. "Family traditions matter," she said. "People need stability. They need to know where they belong." The statement sounded harmless, yet I understood exactly what she meant. Stability depended on controlling information. Belonging depended on accepting the story she had written. I smiled politely. "That makes sense," I replied. The confidence in her expression grew immediately. She thought she had won. A few days later, I received an unexpected call from James Whitmore. We met again at the same cafe overlooking the park. This time he brought a thin folder. Everything inside was publicly accessible, but gathering it required experience and patience. He placed it on the table without saying much. "You are getting close," he said quietly. "Close enough that people may begin noticing." I opened the folder and reviewed the contents. Several records connected names, dates, and decisions in ways I had not fully understood before. More importantly, They confirmed that the missing family member had not disappeared by accident. Deliberate choices had been made. Deliberate efforts had followed. I looked up at James. Did many people know? I asked. He thought for a moment. Some suspected. Very few understood the full picture. As I drove home, I realized something important. I already had enough evidence to expose the truth privately, but exposing it privately would allow the story to be buried again. Evelyn had spent years controlling information because she understood one simple fact. People tend to believe the version of history they hear first. That meant timing mattered. Context mattered. Witnesses mattered. The anniversary celebration was no longer just a family event. It was the moment when every person who had been told the same carefully edited story would finally hear the parts that had been removed. Until then, I would remain patient. I would keep smiling. I would keep listening. And I would let Evelyn become more certain than ever that her secret was still safe. The anniversary celebration arrived on a warm Saturday evening in late spring. The event was held at a country club just outside town, a place Evelyn had chosen because she loved appearances and tradition. Strings of soft lights hung across the outdoor terrace. White tablecloths covered every table. Family photographs from different decades were displayed along one wall for guests to enjoy. More than 60 people attended. Relatives traveled from neighboring states. Old friends stopped by. Former business associates greeted one another near the entrance. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling, laughing, and sharing memories. It was exactly the kind of gathering Evelyn enjoyed most. She moved through the crowd like a hostess welcoming guests into her personal kingdom. Daniel stood beside me as we entered the reception area. "Mom looks happy," he said. I followed his gaze. Evelyn was standing near the center of the room, speaking with several relatives. Her smile was bright. Her posture was confident. She looked completely at ease. "She does?" I replied. In my handbag rested a thin folder containing copies of every document I had spent weeks collecting. I had reviewed them so many times that I practically knew every date and signature by memory. Yet I felt surprisingly calm. The anxiety that had followed me during the investigation was gone. Facts have a way of creating confidence. The truth no longer felt uncertain. It felt inevitable. Throughout the evening, I watched Evelyn carefully. The more comfortable she became, the more obvious her habits appeared. She controlled conversations without seeming controlling. She corrected details whenever someone remembered events differently. She guided stories towards safe territory. Most people never noticed because she had been doing it for years. It was simply part of who she was. During dinner, she stood and delivered a speech celebrating family values, loyalty, and legacy. Guests applauded warmly. Several relatives wiped away emotional tears. Daniel smiled proudly at his mother. I remained silent. The speech was polished and heartfelt. It was also incomplete. After dessert, guests began gathering near the photograph display. Conversations filled the room. Laughter echoed from table to table. This was the moment I had anticipated for weeks. Not because I wanted attention, not because I wanted revenge, because everyone who had been told the same carefully edited story was finally together in one place. Evelyn approached me holding a glass of sparkling water. "I am glad you came tonight," she said. "Family matters more than anything." Her tone was pleasant, but I recognized the familiar confidence beneath it. She still believed she understood exactly what everyone around her knew. "I agree," I said. "Family deserves honesty." For the first time that evening, something shifted in her expression. It lasted only a moment. A small pause. A slight narrowing of her eyes. Then the smile returned. "Of course," she said. Nearby, several relatives were discussing old photographs displayed on the wall. One image had drawn particular attention because it came from the exact period connected to the records I had uncovered. Guests were beginning to ask questions. Simple questions. Ordinary questions. Questions that had never been answered properly. I could feel the atmosphere changing. Not dramatically. Not yet. Just enough to create curiosity. Evelyn noticed it too. Her attention moved toward the growing group near the display. Then she looked back at me. For the first time since this entire journey began, I saw something I had never seen in her before. Uncertainty. She did not know how much I knew. She did not know what evidence I possessed. And she did not know that before the evening ended, the story she had spent more than 20 years protecting was about to become impossible to hide. The room grew quieter as more relatives gathered around the display of old photographs. Questions began moving from one person to another. Dates were mentioned. Names were repeated. Memories surfaced. I watched Evelyn carefully. For years, she had navigated moments like this with ease, stepping in before curiosity became discovery. This time was different. Too many pieces were already in motion. I walked toward the group and picked up one of the photographs from the display table. It showed several family members at an event more than 20 years earlier. Among them was a face most people could not identify. "Who is this?" one cousin asked. The question hung in the air. Several people leaned closer. A few shrugged. Others looked toward Evelyn, expecting her to provide the answer she always seemed to have. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled and dismissed it as an old family friend. The explanation might have worked years earlier. It did not work now. "Actually," I said calmly, "that is not what the records show." The room became still. Daniel turned toward me. Evelyn's expression hardened almost instantly. I opened the folder I had carried all evening and removed several copies of public documents. Nothing confidential, nothing obtained improperly, just facts, dates, signatures, records, information anyone could verify. I handed copies to Daniel first, then to several relatives standing nearby. Nobody spoke as they read. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have. I explained what I had discovered over the previous weeks. The trust, the property records, the repeated name, the missing pieces of family history. Most importantly, I explained that a member of the family had been intentionally removed from the story everyone had been told. Gasps were replaced by confusion. Confusion was replaced by questions. Questions were replaced by understanding. Daniel stared at the documents for what felt like forever. His eyes moved from page to page. Then he looked at his mother. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. Evelyn did not answer immediately. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unable to control the direction of the conversation. The people around her were no longer waiting for instructions. They were examining evidence. They were comparing memories. They were connecting details that had never made sense before. Eventually, Evelyn sat down and lowered her eyes. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. She admitted that certain decisions had been made years ago. She admitted that information had been withheld. She admitted that she believed she was protecting the family. Nobody shouted. Nobody caused a scene. The truth itself was powerful enough. Daniel remained silent for a long time. Several relatives asked questions. Others simply reflected on everything they had learned. The evening continued, but it was no longer the same celebration. It had become something more honest. As guests slowly began leaving, I stepped outside onto the terrace. The night air felt cool and peaceful. Behind me, conversations continued quietly inside the building. After a few minutes, Daniel joined me. "You knew all of this?" he asked. "Not at first," I said. "I followed the facts." He nodded slowly. Then he looked back through the window toward the reception hall. "I always thought Mom controlled everything because she wanted what was best for everyone." I understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes people become so focused on controlling the story that they forget the truth matters more. He stood beside me for a moment before quietly agreeing. As I watched the lights reflected across the dark lawn, I realized something important. I had not ruined Evelyn's reputation. I had not destroyed her life. I had simply opened a door she spent years keeping closed. In the end, the truth accomplished everything on its own.